Usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, whether it's a broken engine or a broken arm, there's this expectation of precision.
Right. It's a very comforting way to look at the world.
Yeah, it's like engineering. You take an x-ray of your arm, you see that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is. That's the break.
It's binary, It's a
Yeah,
localized problem that theoretically has a localized solution. You just, well, put a cast on it and it heals.
exactly. Broken or not broken, it's clean. But then you step into the world of 19th century geopolitical history and specifically the mechanics of global capitalism and social movements, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, totally useless.
You're looking at a historical and diagnostic landscape that is honestly incredibly murky. You can't just point to one factory and say, oh, there's the problem right there.
Because the problem isn't localized at all. The break in the bone, so to speak, is systemic. And to really see it, you have to zoom out significantly.
Which is exactly what we are doing today. We are diving into a massive, incredibly dense stack of material. I'm talking decades worth of letters, articles, and theoretical texts from the Marx and Engels collected works.
Often referred to as the MECW for short.
Right, the MECW. And the mission for you, the listener, today is to explore a wildly important, though I'd say sometimes less discussed, aspect of their work.
Yeah, it's definitely an underappreciated angle.
We're going to look at how they turn their gaze beyond Europe, beyond the textile mills of Manchester and the barricades of Paris, to the fate of oppressed nations and colonies. They discovered that you couldn't just look at the local X-ray.
No, you really couldn't.
The liberation of the working class was actually impossible without the liberation of oppressed nations worldwide.
And that represents a profound evolution in their thinking. I mean, if you only read their early, most famous texts, you might walk away thinking they viewed history purely as a localized struggle.
Like just classes within a single industrialized nation.
Exactly. Just the factory owners versus the factory workers. But when you dig into this broader collection of their journalistic writings and private correspondence, a completely different, much more global picture emerges.
It really does.
Marx and Engels recognized that colonial expansion and the subjugation of entire nations were the actual engines powering global capitalism. You couldn't dismantle the inequalities of the 19th century without dismantling the empires that fed them.
And before we get into the weeds of how they came to that realization, I want to give our listeners a quick heads up. We are looking at some very polarizing revolutionary texts today.
Very much so.
Because the sources we're exploring contain politically charged concepts and revolutionary theories, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking sides.
Right.
Nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the original authors. Our job today is to impartially report on the content provided and help you understand the ideas contained in the original source material. We're just decoding the mechanics of their arguments.
And it's an incredibly rich body of material to decode. We are talking about their day-to-day journalistic writings for papers like the New York Daily Tribune, their private letters to each other spanning decades, and their exhaustive studies of military strategy.
This is a lot of reading.
It is. And when you synthesize all of this, their core premise is striking. The center of global power relies entirely on the extraction and subjugation of the periphery.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's figure out where that realization first caught fire for them. Because when we think of Marx and Engels, the mind immediately goes to the Communist Manifesto in 1848, right? Workers of the world unite.
Of course, that's the classic image.
But 1848 wasn't just about factory workers. Europe was exploding with a completely different kind of conflict.
Yeah, the year 1848 is famously known as the Spring of Nations. You had massive continent-wide uprisings.
National uprisings.
Exactly. And what's fascinating in these sources is how incredibly active Marx and Engels were in their support for national liberation struggles in places like Poland, Hungary, and Italy.
They were really in the thick of it.
They weren't just sitting in the British Museum writing abstract economic theories. They were deeply, passionately invested in redrawing the geopolitical map of Europe.
But wait, help me square that circle. Because if their entire philosophical framework is built on class struggle,
The proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, right?
right, then why get so invested in whether Poland gets to be an independent nation
Yeah.
or whether Italy gets to unify? Doesn't fighting for a nation inherently blur the lines of class struggle?
It seems like it would, yes.
Like if you're a Polish worker fighting for Polish independence, aren't you fighting alongside your Polish boss?
That is the crucial tension. And to understand how they resolved it, you have to look at who they were fighting against. You have to look at the oppressors.
Okay, who are the oppressors?
Well, in 19th century Europe, Marx and Engels viewed the Austrian Empire, the Prussian monarchy, and above all, Russian Tsarism as the ultimate bulwarks of feudal and absolutist reaction.
So they were the final bosses of the old world order.
Final bosses is a great way to put it. These empires were the great counter-revolutionary forces of the era. Tsarism in particular was the great shadow hanging over the continent.
Why Tsarism specifically?
Marx and Engels reasoned that as long as these massive reactionary empires existed, any democratic or working-class revolution in Western Europe was under constant threat. If the workers of Paris or Berlin rose up, the Russian Tsar or the Austrian Emperor would simply march their massive armies across the border and crush them.
Which is exactly what happened in many cases.
Over and over again. Therefore, the revolutionary democratic movements in Poland, Hungary, and Italy weren't just side issues.
They weren't distractions.
No, they were vital strategic allies. By shaking the foundations of the Habsburg Empire or tying up the armies of the Russian Tsar, these national liberation movements were effectively acting as a shield for the European proletariat.
Wow, so they were tearing down the walls that protected the old oppressive order. So their support wasn't just some bleeding heart, principled stance on national freedom. It was cold, hard geopolitical strategy.
Very much so.
But as I was reading through the sources, I noticed there's also a very deep structural theory at play here. There's a quote from Engels that is referenced constantly, and it really stopped me in my tracks.
Is that the one about a nation's freedom?
Yes, he declared, a nation cannot become free and at the same time continue to oppress other nations.
It's a famous line.
And it sounds almost like a moral platitude, like, hey, don't be a hypocrite, guys.
Yeah.
But the sources suggest they meant this quite literally. Structurally.
Oh, they meant it as an inescapable structural reality. They applied this principle to Germany's historical oppression of its neighbors, to England's oppression of Ireland, to Russia's hold over Poland.
So how does the mechanic of that work?
To understand the mechanics, you have to look at what oppressing another nation actually requires on the ground. You can't just politely ask a neighboring country to stay subjugated and hand over their wealth.
Right, you need force.
Yeah.
You need a lot of it.
An immense amount of force. To keep another nation down, the oppressing nation has to build and maintain a massive apparatus of violent coercion.
What does that apparatus look like?
You need a massive standing army. You need a labyrinthine secret police force. You need ruthless tax collectors, compliant judges, and an entire bureaucracy dedicated to subjugation.
And what Marx and Engels are pointing out is that once a ruling class builds that massive machine of violent coercion, they don't just leave it at the border.
It always comes home.
Always.
Inevitably, the ruling class turns that exact same apparatus inward to suppress their own working class.
No.
The troops that are trained and brutalized into putting down a rebellion in a colonized territory are the exact same troops who will be called in to fire on a crowd of striking workers in the capital.
So the tools of oppression are totally interchangeable.
Completely. The secret police who learn their trade spying on foreign dissidents will absolutely use those same methods to spy on domestic labor organizers.
It's like a prison guard. Think about it. The guard might have the keys, right? They might be the one calling the shots.
Right.
But to keep the prisoners locked up, the guard has to spend their entire life sitting inside a prison too. They're confined by the very system they manage.
That is a fantastic analogy.
If you build a machine designed to crush human freedom abroad, you've just built a machine perfectly capable of crushing you at home. The oppressor cages themselves.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. And Marx and Engels watched this dynamic play out in real time. The texts frequently point out the profound hypocrisy of bourgeois politicians of the era who tried to navigate this.
Give me an example. Who are they looking at?
A prime example they dissect is Napoleon III of France.
The nephew of the original Napoleon.
Yes. Napoleon III loved to cloak himself in what was called the principle of nationalities. He posed as this great, enlightened defender of nations, claiming to support the liberation of oppressed peoples across Europe.
But Marx wasn't buying it.
Not at all. Marx wrote a blistering polemic, a work called Herr Folk, where he completely exposed this as a cynical smokescreen.
So what was Napoleon III actually trying to do, if not liberate people?
He was running a predatory foreign policy disguised as humanitarian intervention. Napoleon III was using the genuine national aspirations of smaller countries to weaken France's rivals, like Austria.
Okay, so a power grab.
Right, to expand his own borders, and crucially, to distract his domestic population from the fact that he was running a highly authoritarian regime at home in France.
So the elites are basically standing on a balcony, pointing outward, yelling, "Look over there! Look at this noble national cause we are fighting for," while their other hand is behind their back, tightening the screws on their own workers.
It's the oldest trick in the book, weaponizing nationalism to pit people against each other. Marx argued that this kind of cynical manipulation by the ruling class could never lead to true freedom.
Because the underlying system hasn't changed.
Right. He wrote that the true brotherhood of nations requires abolishing the existing property relations that cause one nation to exploit another in the first place.
Because if the economic system is still based on extracting wealth from a weaker country, the oppression will continue, no matter what noble rhetoric you dress it up in.
Precisely. In their view, the victory of the working class was the necessary signal of liberation for all oppressed nations, because only by fundamentally changing the economic engine could you remove the incentive for oppression.
Okay, that makes perfect sense in the context of mainland Europe. Poland, Italy, Hungary, these were the theoretical and literal battlegrounds for Europe's future.
Yes, absolutely.
But if we trace the timeline and the sources, Marx and Engels realized that the ultimate, most intensive test case for this theory wasn't happening in the Austrian Empire or the Russian steppes.
No, it was much closer to home.
It was happening right in England's backyard.
You're talking about Ireland.
We have to talk about Ireland. If you want to understand how colonialism poisons the working class of the colonizer, how that prison guard locks himself in his own cell, Ireland is the laboratory.
It truly became the linchpin of their entire theory on emancipation. Marx and Engels conducted an incredibly deep, exhaustive study of English colonial rule in Ireland.
And what's the context for them studying this?
Well, the context here is vital. Engels lived in Manchester for many years. He lived in the heart of industrial England, where a massive population of Irish immigrants lived in absolute destitution.
So it was right in front of him.
Exactly. He wasn't just reading about this in a library. He saw the brutal reality of it on the streets every single day. His partner, Mary Burns, was a fierce working-class Irish woman who guided him through the Manchester slums.
The sources describe what was happening in Ireland in the mid-19th century in, honestly, chilling terms. Marx called it a quiet, business-like extinction.
A very haunting phrase.
Break down the mechanics of that for us. What exactly was happening on the ground?
He was referring to the ruthless economic policies imposed by the British in the decades following the Great Famine in the 1840s.
Okay.
The famine itself was a catastrophe, obviously, but what happened after was a managed, deliberate economic clearing. The English absentee landlords were systematically clearing the land of people.
How do you clear a country of its people?
Through mass, forced evictions of small Irish tenant farmers. The landlords realized that the changing global market made large-scale capitalist pasturage much more profitable than having hundreds of small tenant families growing potatoes.
Wait, so they were basically replacing human beings with sheep and cattle just because meat and wool fetched a higher price in the English market.
That is exactly what they did. The Irish peasantry was consigned to either starvation in the ditches or the agonizing process of forced emigration, mostly to America, or the industrial slums of England.
That's horrifying.
They were being quite literally wiped off their own land to serve the economic interests of the English ruling class. And studying this deliberate extinction led Marx to one of the most profound realizations of his life. It was a massive shift in his strategic thinking.
Because initially, he had it backward, right?
Yeah.
He thought the English workers were going to be the ones to ride in and save the day.
Yeah, for a long time, Marx held the traditional view that the English working class, because they were situated in the most advanced capitalist country in the world, would be the vanguard.
The leaders of the revolution.
Right. He believed they would rise up, overthrew their own ruling class, and in doing so, they would automatically free Ireland as a byproduct.
Like a trickle-down liberation.
Exactly. He thought the revolution in the Imperial center would liberate the colonial periphery.
But the deeper he studies Ireland, and specifically the Fenian movement, which is the Irish Revolutionary Movement, he completely flips the script.
A total reversal. After exhaustive analysis, Marx concluded the exact opposite. He realized that the English working class could never achieve its own emancipation until Ireland was free.
Never.
Never. The liberation of the oppressed nation wasn't a neat little byproduct of the workers' revolution. It was the absolute, non-negotiable precondition for it.
Let's pause here, because that is a massive counterintuitive claim. Why couldn't the English factory workers Just unionize, strike, take over parliament, and fix things themselves. Why was their fate so fundamentally tied to an agricultural island across the sea?
To understand that, we have to look at the masterful psychological and social engineering achieved by the English bourgeoisie. They used Ireland to build an invisible wall right down the middle of the working class.
An invisible wall.
Yes, Marx drew an incredibly sharp, devastating analogy in a letter he wrote in 1870. He compared the fierce, artificially nourished hatred between the English and Irish proletarians to the racial antagonism in the United States.
Oh, I have that exact quote from the sources right here, and it is striking. He says, "The average English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers wages and the standard of life. He regards him somewhat like the poor whites of the southern states of North America regarded black slaves."
It is a brilliant, terrifying analysis of how division works.
Yeah.
Marx saw exactly how the mechanics of this operated. By artificially impoverishing Ireland through those mass evictions we talked about, the English ruling class forced a massive wave of desperate, starving Irish immigrants into English industrial centers like Manchester and London.
And if you are starving and your family is starving, you will accept literally any wage just to survive.
Exactly. So the Irish immigrants flood the labor market and wages drop. But here is the trick. The English worker doesn't look at the factory owner who is choosing to pay lower wages.
Right.
And they don't look at the English landlord who evicted the Irish worker in the first place. The English worker looks at the Irish worker and sees a direct existential threat. They see a competitor.
Meanwhile, the factory owner is sitting in his club, smoking a cigar, laughing all the way to the bank, just playing them against each other.
But the manipulation goes much deeper than just the economics of wage competition. It's also about what W.E.B. Du Bois would later call the psychological wage.
What was the psychological wage for the English worker?
The English worker was fed a constant daily diet of national and religious superiority by the press, the politicians, and the pulpit.
The sources talk about this. The English worker was made to feel like part of the aristocracy, even if they were starving in a slum.
Right. An English worker could be working 14 hours a day in a dangerous, lung-destroying textile mill, living in absolute squalor, but he could still puff out his chest, walk into a pub and say, "At least I'm a member of the ruling nation, at least I'm an Englishman, and not a lowly Catholic Irishman."
Wow.
That psychological wage, that false, intoxicating sense of superiority, tied the English worker directly to the English aristocrat. They made common cause with their own oppressors against the Irish.
So going back to that quote, a nation cannot become free and at the same time continue to oppress other nations. We see the prison guard analogy in full effect.
Exactly.
By adopting the prejudice of the ruling class, by viewing the Irish as biologically or culturally beneath them, the English workers completely shattered any chance of working-class solidarity.
It was self-sabotage on a mass scale.
The bourgeoisie didn't even need to send in the police to break the unions. The workers were breaking themselves over national divisions.
That was Marx's grand realization. He wrote that this antagonism is the true secret of maintaining its power, meaning the bourgeoisie's power. It wasn't an accident. It was artificially nourished and kept alive.
The sources also use a very specific mechanical metaphor when talking about Ireland. They call Ireland the lever. What was the strategic significance of Ireland to the British Empire itself? Why the lever?
Ireland was the foundational bulwark of the English landed aristocracy. It was the original colony and their greatest source of moral and material force.
Okay, so it was the bedrock.
English landlordism dominated Ireland, and the immense wealth extracted from Irish soil, the rents, the agricultural goods that funded their political power back in London. Marx argued that if you wanted to strike a fatal blow against the English ruling class, you couldn't do it in England.
Why not England?
Because the working class in England was too hopelessly divided by that prejudice we just discussed, and the ruling class was too entrenched, too wealthy, and too well-armed. A direct assault in the center would fail.
You can't attack the fortress from the front gate. You have to find the structural weakness.
You have to pull the lever. And that lever was located in Ireland. Marx argued that if the Irish overthrew the English landlords and achieved agrarian revolution and independence, the economic foundation of the English aristocracy would completely crumble.
So they lose their money.
Furthermore, it would strip away the moral force of the English ruling class, the prestige and myth of their invincible empire.
So only by actively supporting Irish independence could the English working class break their own hypnotic spell. They had to realize that the empire wasn't making them rich, it was keeping them subjugated. Only then could they realize their true interests and turn against their own exploiters.
And their conclusion on this was absolutely uncompromising. They insisted that the International Working Men's Association must publicly and loudly demand the separation of Ireland from England.
So it was a formal policy position.
Yes. And they were clear, this wasn't out of charity. It wasn't out of simple humanitarian sympathy for the Irish. It was a vital strategic necessity for the English workers themselves.
Think about the relevance of this dynamic for a second, because it is staggering. How often do we see modern political systems operate on this exact same playbook?
Constantly.
Manufactured cultural, national, or even regional rivalries used to prevent working people from uniting over shared economic interests. You just keep the people at the bottom fighting each other over scraps, or over borders, or over identity, so they never look up to see who is actually hoarding all the wealth.
It is the defining mechanism of capitalist control.
And Marx and Engels were dissecting this playbook in the 1860s, and honestly, it hasn't lost an ounce of its potency.
Not at all.
Which brings us to a terrifying global realization. If Ireland was the laboratory for English colonial exploitation, if that was where they perfected these methods of division, extraction, and psychological manipulation, then Asia and Africa were the massive global factories where this exploitation was scaled up to an industrial level.
The empire didn't stop at the Irish Sea.
Not even close. And this is where Marx and Engels expand their scope dramatically. Moving into the 1850s, they began systematically publishing articles, dozens of them, many for the New York Daily Tribune, which had a massive circulation focusing heavily on the situation in colonial countries.
They fiercely, meticulously condemned the colonial expansion by capitalist powers in places like India, China, and Algeria.
Let's start with India, because the sources dedicate a massive amount of ink to it. And frankly, the British East India Company is one of the most wild, almost unbelievable historical entities to ever exist. How did Marx and Engels analyze their operations?
They were brutal in their assessment, stripping away all the romantic mythology of empire. Marx referred to the East India Company as a group of merchant adventurers who conquered India to make money out of it.
Right to the point.
They completely rejected the narrative that this was some noble, civilizing mission bringing railroads and enlightenment to the East. It was organized, militarized plunder.
And to give our modern listeners a sense of how crazy this was, imagine a modern, multinational tech or resource monopoly. Imagine a giant oil company or a massive logistics firm. Now, imagine that this corporation possesses its own massive standing army, a huge navy, and the legal right to conquer sovereign territories, mint its own coins, collect taxes, and execute its rivals.
It's absurd when you put it like that.
But that was the British East India Company. It was a corporation operating as a predatory state.
It's a terrifying concept. And the question Marx asked was, how does a corporate entity from a small, damp island in the North Atlantic manage to conquer a massive, populous, ancient subcontinent like India?
Yeah, how did they do it? Because it wasn't just overwhelming technological superiority, right?
No, the technological gap wasn't massive enough to explain the total subjugation of millions of people. To achieve that, they used a very specific, ancient, and deeply cynical strategy. Marx noted they made wide use of the ancient Roman principle of divide et impera.
Divide and rule.
Divide and rule.
Just like they did with the English and Irish workers, but now played out on a macro geopolitical chessboard.
Exactly. The company arrived and took complete advantage of India's political fragmentation. They ruthlessly exploited religious and communal heterogeneity and the existing strife between local princes and rulers.
So they didn't just march in and fight everyone at once.
Oh, no. They would approach a local aristocrat, offer them military support against their rival, and bind them with what were called subsidiary treaties.
How did those treaties work in practice?
It was essentially a mafia protection racket. The company would force the local prince to pay for the upkeep of the British troops that were now protecting them.
Oh, I see where this is going.
The cost was always exorbitant, completely designed to be unpayable. The prince would naturally fall into massive debt to the company.
And when they couldn't pay.
The company would foreclose on their kingdom. The sources say, after having won over their allies in the way of ancient Rome, the East India Company executed them in the modern manner of Change Alley.
Change Alley being the financial and usury center in London. Meaning they didn't just assassinate them with swords, They bankrupted them, swallowed their lands through debt traps, and destroyed them financially.
It was a hostile corporate takeover backed by artillery. But Marx and Engels also addressed a deeper, more theoretical question. What made these massive Eastern empires structurally vulnerable to this kind of infiltration in the first place?
Right, because if they were so advanced historically, why did they fall prey to this? Did Marx and Engels look at the internal socioeconomic structure of these regions?
They did, and their analysis here is very specific to the historical and geographical context of the time. Marx argued that the source of their vulnerability to Western conquest lay in their specific socioeconomic structure, often referred to in broader Marxist theory as the Asiatic mode of production.
What does that mean exactly?
He pointed to two main factors. First, the isolated nature of small village communities, and second, the heavy concentration of resources in the hands of despotic rulers.
The text mentions the absolute necessity of massive public works for irrigation, right? How does that tie into political vulnerability?
It's a fascinating environmental and economic link. Because of the climate and geography in places like India and parts of the Middle East, agriculture required massive, sophisticated irrigation systems, dams, canals, reservoirs.
I can't just rely on the rain.
Right. And a small village of farmers cannot build and maintain a massive regional dam.
So you need a massive centralized authority to organize that kind of labor.
Exactly. So out of geographical necessity, a strong, centralized, despotic state emerges to manage the water and collect the taxes. But the side effect of this is that it creates a ceiling on economic development.
How so?
Well, the state controls the major infrastructure, while at the base you have thousands of small, self-sufficient village communes that are totally isolated from each other. They weave their own clothes, grow their own food, and have no real connection to the wider world other than paying taxes to the despot.
So it's politically stagnant. There's no dynamic, decentralized, rising capitalist class like you had developing in Europe at the time.
Precisely. Because they were structurally stagnant and isolated, they became easy prey. When the British East India Company showed up, they didn't have to conquer a unified, cohesive nation.
They just had to conquer the guy at the top.
They just had to decapitate the central despotic authority, take over the tax collection and the water management, and the isolated villages simply carried on, largely defenseless.
Until the company started aggressively destroying those village economies too. I mean, they flooded India with cheap British textiles, completely wiping out the ancient, world-renowned Indian weaving industry. Millions starved.
It was total devastation.
And once the West was firmly entrenched, the brutality was staggering. There's a phrase Marx uses that is just brilliant. He talks about the hypocrisy of bourgeois civilization going naked in the colonies.
It is arguably one of his most powerful, searing observations on imperialism. He wrote, "The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home, where it assumes respectable forms, to the colonies, where it goes naked."
It's such a vivid image. Basically, the ruling class wears a top hat, reads polite literature, and talks endlessly about the rule of law, property rights, and human rights in the parlors of London or Paris.
Yes, very proper.
But the moment they step off the boat in Calcutta or Algiers, they shed all those respectable forms and engage in open, unapologetic plunder, torture, and slaughter.
Because the laws of civilization didn't apply to the periphery. The sources detail the French conquest of Algeria, for example, to show that this wasn't just a British phenomenon.
What did Engels say about Algeria?
Engels describes the French campaign as an arena of unceasing bloodshed, rapine, and violence. He goes into detail about the terrible razzias.
What were the razzias?
They were basically scorched earth, punitive expeditions. French troops would sweep through a region, burn the dwellings, destroy the crops, slaughter the livestock, and massacre the local populations who were fiercely defending their independence.
And people back home just accepted this.
Oh, the respectable European bourgeois back in Paris was perfectly comfortable reading about these atrocities in the morning paper, so long as it secured North Africa for French capital and yielded a high return on investment.
But the crucial thing Marx and Engels highlighted is that the colonized peoples didn't just roll over and accept this extinction. The sources heavily emphasize that the 1850s were a period of massive, explosive anti-colonial resistance.
Very much so. Marx and Engels didn't just document the oppression, they closely followed the resistance. They wrote extensively about the great 1857 Indian uprising, often derogatorily called the Sepoy Mutiny. by the British and the fierce Chinese resistance during the Second Opium War.
The Opium Wars. Honestly, nothing screams respectable bourgeois civilization quite like fighting a massive bloody war for the sole purpose of forcing another sovereign country to legalize your massive state-sponsored drug trafficking operation.
It is the ultimate distillation of colonial capitalism. Britain needed Chinese tea, but didn't want to pay for it with silver. So they grew opium in India, smuggled it into China, created millions of addicts, and when the Chinese government tried to stop the drug trade to save its people,
Britain sent in the gunboats.
she sent in the gunboat.
Yeah, the British press, of course, lost their minds when the Chinese or the Indians fought back.
Oh, the London newspapers were filled with screaming headlines about the horrible atrocities committed by the Chinese or the Indian rebels. They portrayed the colonized peoples as bloodthirsty savages resisting civilization. But Marx and Engels completely flipped the script.
How so?
They argued that you couldn't judge an insurgent nation fighting for its very survival by abstract, polite drawing room standards.
Engels wrote that the means used by a nation defending its independence are measured by the violence used by the oppressors. If you use terror to conquer them, you cannot clutch your pearls when they use terror to expel you.
Exactly. They saw these uprisings not as mere military mutinies over religious grievances, which is how the British tried to frame them, but as the awakening of the masses. They saw the beginnings of true national liberation movements.
And structurally, they saw them as natural allies to the European proletariat.
This represents a massive theoretical breakthrough. Marx essentially saw two potential paths for the liberation of the colonies. One path was what he originally thought.
A proletarian revolution in the capitalist countries. The British workers overthrow the bourgeoisie and willingly free India.
Right. But the second path, which he now saw as equally viable and deeply interconnected, was that the oppressed nations themselves would grow strong enough to throw off the colonial yoke altogether.
The sources refer to the revolutionary processes in the East as a spark thrown into the overloaded mine of the present industrial system. I love that phrasing.
It's incredibly evocative. They theorized that by inflicting massive blows on the colonial system, by cutting off the flow of wealth, raw materials, and captive markets, the national liberation movements would severely weaken the position of capitalism in the metropolis.
Oh, I see.
If India breaks free, the East India Company loses its wealth, the British bourgeoisie loses a massive source of its power and prestige, and suddenly the British working class has a much better chance of staging a successful revolution.
The struggles in Manchester and the struggles in Delhi were deeply organically structurally linked. So we have this vast, intricate global web of exploitation and resistance. But the ruling classes of these capitalist powers weren't just exploiting the colonies in perfect harmony.
Right.
They were constantly at each other's throats, fighting over who got to exploit the colonies.
Always.
Which brings us to the strategic game. These colonial prizes became the chess pieces in massive superpower conflicts that defined the geopolitics of the 19th century.
If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, we can see how Marx and Engels analyzed grand strategy and foreign policy. And the perfect, most detailed case study in the sources is their coverage of the Crimean War.
The Crimean War, which broke out in 1853. Just to set the board for our listeners, it's the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, so Turkey teaming up to fight against the Russian Empire. Now, based on everything we discussed earlier, Marx and Engels absolutely despised Russian Tsarism. They saw it as the ultimate reactionary oppressive threat to Europe. So naturally, shouldn't they have been cheering for Britain and France?
You would certainly think so, if you only looked at the surface. And many liberal and democratic commentators in Europe at the time framed it exactly that way. They wrote glowing editorials portraying the Crimean War as a noble ideological crusade.
Like the progressive forces of Western liberty and civilization banding together to slay the dragon of Russian despotism.
Yes, that was the popular narrative. But Marx and Engels didn't buy it.
They completely rejected that framing. They looked at the underlying mechanics and exposed the British and French defense of Turkey as a total hypocritical sham.
A complete sham.
Okay, walk me through that. If Britain and France are actively fighting the ultimate bad guy, how is the war a sham?
Because of their actual underlying motives. Marx and Engels didn't just read the lofty speeches of politicians. They relentlessly analyzed parliamentary debates, leaked secret diplomatic correspondence, and hard economic data.
They did the homework.
They really did. And they concluded that the Western powers had absolutely no intention of destroying Tsarism, They didn't want to topple the Russian Empire, and they certainly didn't want to liberate the peoples oppressed by Russia, like the Poles.
So if they didn't want to destroy Russia, what were they actually fighting for?
They were fighting for the balance of power and economic dominance. The Ottoman Empire was in a state of terminal decline. It was widely known as the sick man of Europe.
Right.
Britain and France simply wanted to make sure that when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed, they were the ones who inherited the colonial spoils. They wanted control of the Middle East, the Balkans, the vital trade routes, and they didn't want Russia getting them.
It's exactly like a mafia turf war.
Yeah.
Think about it. You have these massive organized crime syndicates, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire. The Western powers weren't trying to save the neighborhood, which in this case is Turkey and the Balkans.
No, not at all.
They just wanted to make sure they were the ones collecting the protection money instead of the Russians. They were perfectly happy for the neighborhood to be exploited and bled dry, so long as the wealth flowed into the banks of London and Paris instead of St. Petersburg.
That is precisely how Marx and Engels diagnosed the situation. They saw that Britain and France were treating Turkey not as a sovereign, equal ally to be saved, but as a junior partner to be financially and politically subjected.
Wow.
Marx wrote that British diplomacy was defending its own mercenary interests, completely hypocritical in its claims of protecting Turkish independence. In fact, he noted that the British and French were taking advantage of the war to establish effective colonial-style control over Turkey's foreign policy and its finances.
So they were burying Turkey in debt while claiming to save it.
Exactly.
And while the politicians, the diplomats, and the bankers were playing this incredibly cynical, high-stakes game of geopolitical chess in their palaces, who was actually paying the price?
The common soldiers, and this is where Engels really shines in the source material. Engels wasn't just an economist. He was an incredibly astute military analyst. He actually earned the nickname the General among his friends.
I love that.
He wrote dozens and dozens of articles for the New York Tribune analyzing the day-to-day military operations in the Crimea.
Right, he was essentially acting as a real-time military correspondent, breaking down troop movements, supply lines, logistics, and tactics. What was his assessment of the Allied war effort?
It was absolutely scathing. He didn't just report on the battles, he exposed the gross incompetence, the strategic mediocrity, and the deeply oligarchic corruption of the British military administration. He pointed out that the British Army was essentially run by wealthy aristocrats who literally bought their commissions.
They bought their rank, regardless of their actual skill.
Exactly. These were men who were completely destitute of elementary professional military knowledge. They were leading armies because of their bloodline, not their brains.
The sources mention that this horrific incompetence led to needless casualties, catastrophic epidemics, and literal starvation for the ranks in places like Gallipoli and the freezing trenches of the Crimea.
Yes, the logistics were a nightmare. Winter clothing wasn't delivered, medical supplies were non-existent. Engels contrasted the catastrophic blundering of these aristocratic generals with the heroic resistance and immense suffering of the common soldiers on all sides.
So it was a systemic failure.
He showed how the antiquated, rigid structure of the British military wasn't just a military failure. It was a direct reflection of Britain's outdated, aristocratic, and oppressive political system.
The war, for Marx and Engels, wasn't a noble crusade of ideas. It was a bloody, mismanaged tragedy driven entirely by the geopolitical greed of competing empires, paid for in the blood of working-class soldiers.
Precisely. They pierced right through the ideological fog of the era.
It's genuinely amazing how sharply they could see through the propaganda of their own time. They were reading the same newspapers, looking at the same basic information everyone else had access to, but they were applying this ruthless, materialist, structural analysis to figure out who actually stood to gain.
It's a very rigorous way of reading the news.
But having said that, we have to remember, they were also human. They were observing history in real time, attempting to predict the complex trajectory of geopolitics, which meant they didn't have a crystal ball, they sometimes got it wrong, and they had to adjust their theories as the world changed.
This raises a vitally important point about how we should engage with these texts today. The sources are very clear that Marx and Engels were not infallible prophets, and we shouldn't treat their writings as sacred dogma. Their thought evolved.
And nowhere is this evolution more evident than in their changing views on the national question itself, specifically regarding the smaller Slavic nations in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. Because earlier we established that they strongly supported the national liberation of Poland, Italy, and Hungary. But the sources indicate that during the chaos of the 1848 revolutions, Engels had some pretty harsh and ultimately completely incorrect things to say about smaller Slav nations like the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the Southern Slavs.
He did. In articles written in 1848 and 1849, Engels expressed the belief that some of these smaller Slav peoples had essentially lost their historical vitality.
Lost their historical vitality.
Yeah, he called them non-history peoples and believed they had lost their capacity for independent national existence. He actually predicted that they would inevitably be absorbed by their more powerful, centralized neighbors, namely Germany, or a unified Austro-Hungarian state.
Now, wait a minute. That seems to directly contradict their whole liberation of oppressed nation stance that we just spent an hour discussing. Why did he think that? Why throw the Czechs and Slovaks under the bus?
To understand it, we have to look at the specific historical and economic context he was observing at that exact moment. Engels was watching the massive, steamrolling, centralizing force of industrial capitalism.
Okay, capitalism as a centralizing force.
He saw that capitalist development required massive, unified states with large, integrated markets to function efficiently. He believed that the creation of large, centralized states was the unavoidable main tendency of history at that moment.
Ah.
Therefore, he wrongly concluded that smaller, mostly agrarian nations would simply be swept away, economically and culturally absorbed by the larger capitalist engines.
So it was an economic calculation. But there was a very specific political reason, too, right? Something that happened during the 1848 revolutions involving the Habsburg monarchy.
Yes, that is the crucial immediate context. The Austrian emperor, facing massive democratic uprisings in Vienna and Hungary, masterfully exploited the national rivalries within his own empire.
What did he do?
He promised political concessions to some of the smaller, oppressed Slav nations in exchange for their military support.
Divide and rule strikes again.
Exactly. The emperor used troops from these smaller Slav nations to violently crush the revolutionary democratic movements in Vienna and Hungary. Because these specific groups have been manipulated into acting as the counter-revolutionary foot soldiers of the emperor, Engels lashed out at them in his writings. He labeled them as inherently counter-revolutionary forces that stood in the way of progress.
But history proved him wrong. They didn't just fade away into the Austro-Hungarian machine.
Entirely wrong. History did not bear out his prediction that they would just vanish into larger states. The sources point out that Engels, in the heat of the 1848 moment, failed to make due allowance for the irrepressible, enduring struggle of small nations against national oppression.
He underestimated them.
He severely underestimated their cultural resilience, their capacity to fight for their independence, and their ability to eventually create their own viable states.
And the incredible thing, the thing that separates a dogmatist from a true analyst is that they realized they were wrong. As the decades passed, they watched the geopolitical data come in. They saw these smaller nations continue to fight, continue to resist cultural assimilation, and continue to demand autonomy. And they adjusted their hypotheses.
They absolutely did. By the 1860s and beyond, you see a massive, significant shift in their writings. They abandoned those rigid centralization theories that doomed smaller nations. They moved toward firmly and universally supporting the right of all oppressed nations, large or small, to self-determination.
That's a huge shift.
They recognized that the anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle, wherever it happened and whoever was fighting it, was a vital catalyst for global systemic change. Their later writings on Ireland, which we discussed at length, show the complete maturation of this idea.
That the liberation of the oppressed nation is the absolute prerequisite for the liberation of the oppressor nation. I honestly deeply appreciate that evolution.
Yeah.
It proves they weren't just writing dogmatic religious text where every single word from 1848 is sacred and unchangeable. They were acting like scientists. If the historical data, the actual events happening on the ground in the world, didn't match their initial models, they didn't ignore the data, they updated the models. They constantly refined their understanding of how imperialism, nationalism, and class struggle interact.
It's a testament to the fact that their primary commitment was to understanding the actual practical mechanics of emancipation, not to preserving their own intellectual egos. They were searching for the most effective path to unseat global capitalism, and they realized through observation and study that the path had to run through the liberation of the colonies and oppressed nations.
So we've covered a massive amount of ground today. Let's try to summarize the mission we set out on. We dove into the Marx and Engels collected works to explore what is known as the national and colonial question. And what we found, beneath the dense theory and the historical deep dives, is a strikingly modern realization. For these two thinkers, you simply cannot separate the liberation of the working class in the wealthy center from the liberation of oppressed nations on the periphery. They are inextricably linked.
Colonialism was not a side issue for them. It wasn't just a footnote to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It was the very mechanism that divided the workers, enriched the ruling class, and delayed global emancipation.
By extracting staggering amounts of wealth from places like India, China, and Ireland, the ruling classes funded their dominance at home.
And by turning the working classes of the Imperial Center against the colonized peoples, they shattered the solidarity necessary for any successful systemic change.
It's the ultimate divide-and-conquer strategy, played out on a global chessboard, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. And as a listener today, sitting here in the 21st century, I want you to genuinely reflect on this. Look at the modern world. How much of our current wealth, our technology, our geopolitical stability relies on the exact same historical dynamics of a wealthy center extracting labor and resources from a poor periphery? Have the basic underlying structures actually changed, or have they just changed their clothes?
The forms of extraction may be less overtly military today. We might see fewer gunboats and more structural adjustment loans. The control is perhaps more economic, financial, and technological, but the structural imbalance, the reliance of the center on the subjugation of the periphery, remains a defining feature of the global economy.
Which leads me to a final provocative thought to leave you with. We talked earlier about how the English bourgeoisie used the super profits of their empire to slightly elevate the English worker, giving them a false sense of superiority to keep them loyal. Engels later developed this into the concept of a labor aristocracy, a segment of the working class in wealthy nations that is essentially bought off, pacified by the spoils of imperialism.
A very compelling concept.
So mull this over on your own time. How does that concept change the way you look at the standard of living in wealthy Western countries today? Are the comforts of the modern metropolis, the incredibly cheap, fast fashion, the latest smartphones assembled overseas, the year-round imported produce, the entire lifestyle we take for granted, are they still secretly subsidized by the invisible, outsourced, and often brutalized labor of a modern colonial system? Are we still acting as the prison guards, caging ourselves by accepting the cheap spoils of a system that ruthlessly exploits the periphery?
It brings us right back to the beginning. It's the diagnostic muddy waters all over again. If you only look at the X-ray of your own country, your own neighborhood, your own standard of living, you might think the system is healthy and functioning perfectly. But if you zoom out to the entire global body, the fractures, the extractions, and the deep structural breaks become undeniable.
Perfectly said. You have to look at the whole picture to see the truth. Thank you for joining us on this intense, expansive journey through the sources today. It's heavy material, but it is absolutely vital for understanding the historical architecture of the world we live in right now. Keep reading, keep looking beyond the borders, and most importantly, keep questioning the world around you.